Hello and welcome. You are listening to an informed take on current events brought to you by law students and staff of Queen's University, Belfast. This is LawPod.
Hello and welcome to LawPod. I am Dr. Lauren Dempster. I am a lecturer in the School of Law at Queen's University Belfast, and I am delighted to continue our PhD series and be joined by Daniela Suarez Vargas, one of our current PhD students. Daniela, could you tell us a little bit about yourself and briefly introduce your project?
Hi, Lauren. Sure. Thank you for inviting me. I'm quite excited to be here today. My name is Daniela Suarez. I'm a PhD student here at the School of Law. I'm a second-year PhD student. Originally from Colombia. I'm a qualified lawyer back in Colombia and have kind of a legal background, and mainly I have a research background in transitional justice, international criminal law, human rights law. So my current research project, it addresses the issue of sexual violence within armed groups in Colombia, so particularly the situations of forced abortion, forced cohabitation, forced contraception, and some issues of sexual assault and rape that happened within paramilitary groups and guerrilla groups in Colombia. And basically the main goal is try to analyze how the legal narratives on victimhood and criminalization in the Colombian transitional justice has prevented these combatants to be recognized as victims within the transitional justice and access to all the mechanisms of truth, justice, and reparations as any other victim in the conflict should be able to do.
Thank you, Daniela. It's a really important and timely research. Could you tell me a bit more about the rationale behind your project?
Yes, I would say probably to start with the theoretical rationale. I was quite interested in studying the victims' hierarchies and gender hierarchies. So usually you will see how this type of hierarchies kind of overlap between each other. So both type of theories actually analyze how society have social constructions that usually tend to be binary or certain stereotypes about individuals. And it's quite related to dynamics of control, power, and subordination. So for example, in the case of victims, usually you have this stereotype that victims used to be or should be fragile individuals, submissive individuals, that they usually shouldn't resist the attack that they are suffering. And you have the perpetrator that usually it's a stereotype as an individual that it's tough, that is brutal, that is violent, that is in control of the violent situation or the attack. And you see how this kind of overlaps with the stereotypes about women and men, or the social expectations of women and men. So women tend to be described as individuals that are fragile, that are also submissive, that usually don't have any agency or don't resist attacks or usually don't engage in violence. And men tend to have more the tough type of personalities or stereotypes, and more violent and aggressive stereotypes. So usually what has happened is that law has also replicated these notions, these social constructions within the legal frameworks. And in the case of transitional justice, they have also replicated these stereotypes. And in the end, they have excluded the experiences of those individuals who don't properly fit in these categories of victim and perpetrator and the expectations of women and men. So, for example, in the case of a victim who we usually expect to be a woman, so when the woman doesn't behave in these expectations of good woman and a good victim or innocent victim, so if they are not fragile, if they are not submissive, if they are not peaceful, usually the legal system tends to exclude them from their protection, particularly from access into the mechanisms for truth, justice, and reparations.
Thank you, Daniela. Can you tell me why you have chosen Colombia as your case study?
Yes, sure. So I would say that there is like one particular like a practical reason why I pick Colombia, and it's because I'm from there. I'm originally from there, so I'm quite familiar with the context. Like while I was doing my undergrad in Colombia, I was able to see how the whole peace process happened. So like the whole peace negotiations and the final peace agreement, and so on. So it was quite interesting of seeing how sexual violence kind of turned into a priority within the peace process during the whole negotiations and the final peace agreement. So it was quite interesting. And also I have always felt quite fascinated about the complexity of the Colombian conflict. Like there are a lot of actors that participate in the conflict. And also there are a lot of dynamics that they continue to evolve through time, although we are now kind of in a situation where many people think that we are kind of more peaceful situation. In real life, it's not that simple. Like the violence still continues. It's just that it has changed, or the dynamics have changed a bit. So probably that's one of the reasons that I pick the case study of Colombia, and the other reason, like particularly about why sexual violence within armed groups. So I was also able to see how usually the priority in sexual violence was sexual violence against civilian population. So very rarely we talked about sexual violence against other combatants, although we know that that's a real situation and that actually happens in many of the armed groups. It happens, the situation of sexual violence, but it was rarely discussed publicly. So I found quite interesting to be able to start addressing this issue, at least from a theoretical point of view.
Thank you. Obviously, Daniela, you mentioned that the Colombian context is a very complex one, and its transitional justice setup is also quite complex. But for our listeners who are unfamiliar with transitional justice in Colombia, could you say a little bit about what the sort of landscape of transitional justice looks like there, and in particular, perhaps the strands of transitional justice that are of most relevance to your project?
Yeah, so the transitional justice context in Colombia, like just not to go like to very long time ago, just probably like more recent time. So the current process actually started around 2012. So the Colombian government started peace negotiations with one of the biggest guerrilla groups in Colombia, and probably one of the biggest guerrilla groups in Latin America. There is the FARC. Mm-hmm. So they started the negotiations with this group. Eventually, the negotiations ended in a peace agreement in 2016. Although, like this peace agreement actually internationally was seen like a really good agreement, like very comprehensive. It included the voices of many individuals that usually weren't included in previous transitional justice, such as women or other minorities like indigenous communities, Afro-Colombian communities. So it was quite interesting. However, like within the country, actually, it was very controversial. Like the common Colombian, at least the ordinary Colombian citizen from the big cities, didn't saw the peace agreement as a good or a good goal or a success in the Colombian society. Actually, they tend to see as a way of providing impunity for the guerrilla group and their leaders, and let them access to political participation without guaranteeing that they were prosecuted for the crimes that they committed. So because of this and many other political tensions, especially with right-wing parties, in the end, the Colombian peace agreement didn't pass through the referendum of 2016. Actually, like the majority of the Colombian population rejected the peace agreement. So this put in a quite a complex situation against the government, because they didn't know what to do after all the investment that they have to do in this process. But in the end, they just negotiated again, especially with the right-wing parties, and make some amendments to the peace agreement. And later on in 2016, it was finally approved by the Congress, and it started its implementation between late 2016 and 2017. So this peace agreement addresses different factors or different elements of that are related to the conflict or the roots of the conflict in Colombia. So it includes rural reform and land restitution reform. It also includes the political participation for combatants in Colombian politics and political institutions. It includes a really big issue that is called the comprehensive system for justice, truth, reparations, and non-repetition. And it also includes an issue regarding the replacement of illegal crops. And it includes a whole program for demobilization, disarmament, and reincorporation of combatants. And finally, it includes also an issue related to the demining of the country, especially like in rural zones. So regarding my project, I will mainly focus on the issue of the comprehensive system of justice, truth, reparations. Particularly, I think I will try to focus on the special tribunal that was created in this comprehensive system, and also in the reparations programs that will be implemented or that are being implemented through this comprehensive system, and eventually as well with the Truth Commission that is part of this big system. Although there will be my main focus, I think I will also end up referencing or make some references to some previous institutions or previous programs, or at least previous of this 2006 peace agreement that have been implemented, that have also contributed in a certain way or have addressed the issue of sexual violence and sexual violence within armed groups in Colombia.
Thank you, Daniela. In terms of the specific role of sexual violence, from what I've read, one of the sort of notable aspects of transitional justice in Colombia is that sexual violence is being prioritized by the mechanisms. Can you say a bit about what that's actually meant in practice, well, if anything, I guess?
Yes, so this prioritization actually comes because many years ago, sexual violence wasn't a priority in the Colombian conflict. Like, it was seen probably at least as least serious, probably as other crimes that occurred during the conflict, for example, as massacres or maybe disappearances or forced displacement. However, since the mid-2000s or 2010s, it started getting like a bigger relevance in the public debates of Colombia. So in the case of the current peace process, it was a big issue, particularly because all these women movements and feminist activists and former female combatants that also engage in this kind of activism during the peace process actually try to bring the issue of sexual violence as a priority during the whole peace process and the final agreement. So now you can see that, for example, in the case of the Special Jurisdiction for Peace, sexual and gender-based violence is one of the priorities of the tribunal, and they have opened so far 7 cases, 7 macro cases, and from these 7 macro cases, 4 of them include sexual violence. Also, for example, in the agency of reincorporation, they have been also working with the Women Subcommission of the FARC in making programs that can prevent the commission of sexual violence against female combatants during their process of demobilization and reincorporation. There have been also some programs that I think there have been organized by the Ministry of Health, in which it have trained health professionals about how to address victims and survivors of sexual violence related to conflict. And there has also been some programs done by the government to try to train the armed forces to prevent the commission or continuing the commission of sexual violence during the conflict. So I think this has been quite of a relevant progress in the case of Colombia. Of course, like, sexual violence still happens, and there are a lot of challenges still, but it's a good way. Like, I think it's a good improvement, at least compared to 20 years ago, or maybe a bit longer, when we didn't have this type of mechanisms or special mechanisms to address sexual violence. Probably, like, the current challenges that I imagine that still we're going to face is that even though we have all these programs and kind of all this prioritization in paper, in real life, many of these survivors of sexual violence still have to face a lot of bureaucracy and a lot of practical challenges to actually access to these programs. And there is also quite quite an increase or some reports about sexual violence against former female combatants during their reincorporation process that haven't been addressed properly. In the case of, for example, there are a lot of tensions in the border between Venezuela and Colombia, and in this part, actually, there are a lot of movement of armed groups or illegal armed groups, and actually there has been also a lot of issues about sexual violence against Venezuelan immigrants committed by these armed groups. And finally, probably I think it's like one of the biggest issues, or at least the one that is causing a lot of tensions and a lot of debate right now in Colombia, is that there has been a lot of attacks, killings and murders against leaders, also including women leaders who usually try to engage or promote the prosecution of sexual violence in Colombia and to try to include the voices of sexual violence victims in the whole transitional justice process.
Thank you, Daniela, for outlining what is still a really complex and challenging situation. I guess to take a little step back from the Colombian context, as you know, like for many years, a key critique within transitional justice literature has been that victims of sexual and gender-based violence are sort of overlooked or sidelined. Obviously, you've been well into the literature now for a while in your PhD. Like, what do you think sort of the state of the field currently is in terms of representation of or engagement with issues around sexual violence?
Yeah, I think like just as in the case of Colombia, the whole field of transitional justice have also been engaging in this movement of prioritizing sexual violence within the whole mechanisms and even in the theory. So I think, well, I cannot predict exactly how it's going to end up transitional justice, but I can imagine, or like from what I have read, I have found out that transitional justice have tended to include more voices of victims or like different experiences from victims within their studies of sexual violence. So for example, you can find now, like there have also been some studies about like sexual violence against men or sexual violence against a LGBTQ community. You have also find that there are a lot of studies about intergenerational harms or damages from sexual violence victims, so usually mainly related to children who were born from rape, and if they could also be considered as victims because they weren't technically the direct victims of the sexual violence from a first look. There has also been a quite interesting improvement regarding expanding the notion of sexual violence and also including reproductive violence. So usually sexual violence was quite limited to just rape or like sexual assault or sexual trafficking, this type of like very common and very kind of mainstream or controversial issues. However, reproductive violence has also turned quite important. I think even in the case of Colombia, probably is one of the cases which has been a good example about reproductive violence, and maybe transitional justice has been able also to start addressing this issue from the case of Colombia. And we also have seen how transitional justice has now end up kind of analyzing sexual and gender-based violence from a broader perspective, not just about the sexual harms that women or other individuals suffer during conflict, but also other forms of gender violence. So you will see that they are trying also to focus on the consequences of economic violence against women or against LGBTQ community. And for example, also the issues that the women have for accessing into unemployment after the conflict or during the conflict. Other issues, for example, as food security is also a big issue, or land restitution or land access is also a big issue regarding transitional justice. And I think it's also quite important how transitional justice has bring also voices from other communities, so try to pay more attention, for example, to indigenous communities and female indigenous or women indigenous, how they have suffered the consequences of conflict that usually tends to be quite different from like a person who doesn't belong to this type of community. So the Afro-Colombian or Afro-American individuals that have suffered as well this type of violence during the conflict. Yeah, so I would say probably that's quite like the panorama of the transitional justice. I would say it's also quite interesting that transitional justice kind of has moved from the very punitive point of view of justice to a more like restorative and transformative justice that I think it also quite fits well for the sexual violence, because actually allows to bring many voices to the ground, or to listen many voices. Of course, like the voices of the victims are important, but the voices of the perpetrators are also important, and the voices of the community are also important. So they try to gather all these voices in the justice process. So it's quite interesting, and how to reveal the connections of victims, perpetrators with communities, with their families, and eventually with society in the end. So yes, probably I would say that's kind of the dynamics right now in transitional justice in the issues of gender and sexual violence.
Thank you, Daniela. In terms then of that landscape of transitional justice literature, obviously you're in your second year, so you've a way to go. But ultimately, where do you think or hope that your research might fit? Like, what do you want it to contribute to that broader literature?
Yeah, so I would say that I hope that my project or my research will end up contributing to address or to bring a bigger discussion on the issue of sexual violence within armed groups, because it doesn't only happen in Colombia. It has happened like in different conflict situations. You have the cases of Uganda, the Democratic Republic of Congo. There has also been some cases in Northern Ireland, Sierra Leone. So it's quite a common situation that happens, but it's rarely discussed. So probably I will hope that my research contributes to keep like bringing to light or bring into discussion this type of situations that are usually rarely discussed from the academic point of view, but also from the public policy point of view and the legal point of view. So I hope that would contribute, and eventually, although my research is mainly theoretical, so I still hope that through this theoretical basis, we kind of realize about how bias is the legal system, and in a certain way, sometimes the transitional justice frameworks. So we can see that there are many biases and like social constructions within these two systems, and probably just start questioning them, and eventually try to find mechanisms or ways to try to redress these biases, to have a more inclusive and a more transformative, in a certain way, justice in conflict.
Thank you, Daniela. It's really important work, and I think especially focusing on somewhere with such sort of complex power dynamics as the Colombian case study. So I wish you luck with the rest of your project. My final question then is just sort of a reflection on how you found the process of doing a PhD in the age of COVID and everything else.
Well, it has been quite interesting. I think in the end, it still is a quite fulfilling experience, at least for me. I found that there is a lot of autonomy to work, so I really like that. I really enjoyed that I have a lot of autonomy to work in a topic that I actually like. I have read a lot of things, and actually it's quite interesting because I start questioning many biases that I even have about like the Colombian context that usually you don't question about those things. So it's quite interesting to learn this, and also it's completely different from my previous legal background or like legal education, that it's very legalistic. So you usually don't try to see or you don't put legal studies or the law in context or within the social context. So you can actually see the big difference of just kind of creating law or kind of master the law when you don't actually see the reality or the context, the real context of the people who are benefit or actually experience the consequences of law. So that has been quite interesting. I also think it's, at least for me, it has been also really good to have a really good supervisory team. So I really enjoyed to work with my supervisors. They're really, really nice people, and actually they have allowed me to engage in other research that it's related to my research project as well, but also like they address completely different issues. So it's quite interesting for me to have these opportunities and to learn a bit more. And probably like the biggest challenge I would say that so far I have faced, well, probably two challenges. The pandemic, of course, it was quite challenging because I started the PhD in the middle of the pandemic. So yes, it was quite interesting to have everything online, quite challenging, and actually to have like very little social contact with other PhD students or other staff of the university. So probably until very lately, like I have been able to actually engage more with my other PhD colleagues, and it has been quite nice. And still, like when you're a foreigner, I think it's quite a challenge. So the issue of moving abroad, like moving from your original country and from your family, moving away from your family and your friends and everything that you have back there, and moving to another country is quite challenging, especially when you're a foreigner and when you get to a country that you are not familiar at all. But in the end, I still like you learned a lot while living abroad, and it gives you a lot of also I think autonomy and independence as well that has complemented my PhD in a certain way. So yes, I still think it's a quite fulfilling experience in the end.
Thank you for sharing that, Daniela, and thank you so much for joining us. So thank you to Daniela for joining us. This has been LawPod, and thank you for listening.